Hello, I'm Esther Babin.
Hello, I'm Esther Reimer.
I'm the president of the NCSA,
I'm the president of the NCSA,
and I'm the host for this webinar
and I'm the host for this webinar tonight.
So we Dr. Rasmussen here tonight.
We have Dr. Rasmussen here tonight.
She will be presenting on phonemic awareness.
She will be presenting on phonemic awareness.
And I'm wanting to read a short bio.
And I wanted to read a short bio.
Dr. Rasmussen
Dr. Rasmussen is interim dean
of the School of Health and Human Services
of the School of Health and Human Services
of Nazareth College in Washington, New York.
Of Nazareth College in Rochester, New York.
Before becoming interim dean, Kathy was chair of the Communication Science and Disorders Department.
Kathy was chair of the Communication Sciences and Disorders Department.
At Nazareth, she also established and co-directing the Deafness Specialty Preparation Program.
She also established and co-directed the Deafness Specialty Preparation Program.
A joint program with National Technical Institute for the Deaf.
A joint program with the National Technical Institute for the Deaf.
To prepare speech language pathologists.
To prepare speech language pathologists.
To work with deaf children.
For working with deaf children.
Hello.
Kathy and Sylvan, president of the National Acute Speech Association.
Kathy has served as the president of the National Acute Speech Association.
What's that?
It is a certified acute speech instructor.
And is an NCSA certified acute speech instructor.
We have some
people with their mics on. I'm going to mute you.
Sorry. Something good.
Just need to make sure it sounded good.
We'll be recording.
Yes, we'll be recording.
Okay. Kathy is a certified acute speech instructor.
Kathy is an NCSA certified instructor.
It has presented on cueing and phonemic awareness.
And has presented on cueing and phonemic awareness.
To a wide variety of parent and professional audiences.
To a wide variety of parent and professional audiences.
So I'll turn it over to you now, Kathy.
So I'll turn it over to you now, Kathy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here. I'd like to thank the NCSA for this invitation to present, and I'd especially like to thank our CLTs for their work this evening. So I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. So tonight we are talking about visual supports for literacy, comparing cued language and visual phonics. And just to recap a little bit of what Esther said, I've been a certified instructor of cued speech. I have more than 30 years of experience, almost going on 40 years of experience, using and teaching cued speech in a wide variety of contexts. And now I'm serving as interim dean in the School of Health and Human Services at Nazareth College in Rochester, New York. So this content is part of a course that I've developed for Q College, which I developed for speech language pathologists to help them learn how to use cueing in a variety of contexts. And I want to recognize Sandy Mostick for all of her work in developing the Q College platform. So tonight, what are we going to do? Here's a little session preview. I'm going to do an overview of cueing systems, talk about cued speech and visual phonics and what they are. I'll give you a very quickie introduction to phonemic awareness. We'll do a comparison of cued speech and visual phonics. And then I will talk about the language and literacy implications of these two systems. Then we'll talk about CS and VP research and end with discussion and Q&A. And I hope to leave plenty of time for that because I know you'll have questions and things that and comments that you'll want to make. So you might be asking, why talk about visual phonics? Why talk about comparing visual phonics and cued speech? I think that it's really important to recognize that visual phonics has become quite popular, especially recently among teachers of the deaf, among SLPs. And so I think it's really important to know more about these two systems, about visual phonics, about cued speech, and how they can be used, and think about when is one or the other more appropriate. So let's start out then with thinking about these two cueing systems, which are both intended to make spoken language visually accessible. So cued speech was developed in 1966, and visual phonics, which is also called See the Sound, the whole name of the system is Visual Phonics See the Sound, was developed in 1982. So I also want to take a really quick detour here just to mention a third cueing system that you may have heard of. It's becoming quite popular among speech language pathologists. And this is called the PROMPT system, which was developed in the 1970s. And that stands for, it's an acronym for PROMPTS, for restructuring oral, muscular, phonetic targets. That's a mouthful. People just call it the PROMPT system. And a prompt is like another label for a cue. This approach was developed for speech production disorders, and it's supposed to support motor skills for speech. So a therapist uses their hand around the speaker's face, typically a child with a motor speech disorder, to help them support articulation, help them support speech. So I mention this because it's another form of cueing that is becoming popular. And I think just being aware that there are different kinds of cueing, different kinds of prompts that professionals use in a variety of contexts. So learning about them, I think, helps us to understand why would we use cued speech, cued language, why would we use visual phonics, when is it appropriate to do that? So then, and this is just a little bit more about prompt, I won't go into any detail here, but I think the important thing to know is that prompt is more about supporting motor speech development and articulation. And I can go into this later if there's something that you're interested in. But let's go on into thinking about the cued speech system and visual phonics. So this may be review for most of us, but I think it's important to establish some of the foundations, some of the basics of these two systems. So cued speech, we know, has a direct connection to traditionally spoken language. Cued American English is a visual representation of the phonemes of spoken English, or what the layperson typically calls the sounds. But as speech language pathologists, we would think about phonemes, the phonological sounds of our language. So cueing in cued speech provides a visual analog, a visual representation of speech information, of that auditory information. So we combine the mouth movements of speech with hand cues to make phonemes distinct visually. And we know that the system involves 8 consonant hand shapes, 4 vowel placements, which are relatively easy to learn. We know that we put a consonant hand shape in a vowel placement to cue a syllable, and that fluency comes with practice. I'll say just a little bit about terminology here. We know that cued speech is the system. When we are cueing a language, we're using cued language. When we're cueing a specific language, we talk about cued American English or cued British English or cued Spanish. So I generally use those terms interchangeably. Tonight, we're typically thinking about the system of cued speech. So I'll usually say cued speech, but it's perfectly interchangeable in most contexts with cued language, cued American English. So let's contrast that with visual phonics. So in visual phonics, each sound, each phoneme is represented by a separate hand cue or separate movement. So instead of like cued speech, 8 consonant hand shapes, 4 placements, in visual phonics, there are 45 cues, 45 movements, 1 for each phoneme in our language. Each of these cues, each of these movements in VP is intended to suggest or mimic the manner of production of a speech sound, of a phoneme. It's supposed to mimic an articulatory feature. So for example, that phoneme is in visual phonics cued with the flicking the index finger like this. And that's supposed to mimic the touching of the tongue at the alveolar ridge, at that ridge behind your front teeth. It's supposed to mimic the release of the tongue from that ridge. So this movement is supposed to suggest that manner of production of that phoneme. So important concept to remember about VP is that a hand movement occurs for each sound, for each phoneme in a word, different than cueing in that way. So before we roll on into the differences between these systems, I want to take just a minute to define what phonemic awareness is, because phonemic awareness is a skill that both cued speech and visual phonics address, help to develop a skill for. So phonemic awareness is the conscious awareness of the sounds of language, of the phonemes of language, as well as the explicit understanding that words are made up of parts. Words are made up of sounds, of phonemes. Now, not so much that phonemic awareness doesn't have to do with understanding prefixes and suffixes or root words and endings. Phonemic awareness is really about those sound parts of words, those phoneme parts of words, the sound sequences that we use to make words. So let's think about, why is phonemic awareness important? Why do we talk about it? Because of the relationship of phonemic awareness and literacy. The foundational skill of phonemic awareness is really, really important for the development of literacy. Many authorities, many experts, many researchers believe that phonemic awareness is a significant predictor of reading success. Now, some authorities believe that it is the #1 predictor. The most important thing about learning to read is developing phonemic awareness. And then many authorities also point to the fact that some of the most common difficulties in early word reading come from weakness in the ability to process the phonological features of language, to understand, to receive, and then to understand that these words have these phonemic parts, and that this weakness, this lack of skill, leads to difficulty in reading. So other research, other studies suggest that almost half, or sometimes more than half, of reading difficulties are preventable if we work with phonemic awareness, if we help to develop phonemic awareness in preschool, if we help to make preschoolers aware of the construction of words and the phonemic sequence of words. So what is the sequence of phonemic awareness development? How does this happen? It starts out with awareness of sound and play. And typically this also goes along with developing an awareness of rhyme. So some of those songs that we sing with young children, some of those finger plays, some of those early books that we read, Dr. Seuss, etc., that have that rhyme structure, that helps to make kids aware of the phoneme structure of words. That's the first stage of phonemic awareness. And then kids begin to develop that more explicit understanding of the parts of words and be able to identify, oh, that's the beginning sound of that word. That word starts with ba. Later on comes being able to identify final sounds or medial sounds, the vowels in the middle of a word. That's a somewhat more advanced skill. And then comes the ability to manipulate sounds, to delete a sound, like what happens to the word pat when you take the pa sound away? What happens when you flip sounds around in a word? So this ability to manipulate is a more advanced phonemic awareness skill. So when we're thinking about visual phonics and cued speech, we know that they are both multisensory approaches to conveying phonemic awareness, conveying phonemic information. But these two systems have important differences. They were designed to do similar things, but they do it in different ways, which has some interesting implications. So the first one of these differences we want to think about is efficiency. How efficiently these two systems convey phonemic information. So we know that cued speech cues can be used in real-time communication at natural conversational speeds. You all are watching the CLT who's cueing what I say, and I'm working my hardest to not speak at my usual rate, which is about twice the rate I'm speaking. But the CLTs are able to communicate, they're able to convey what I'm saying in real time at natural speech speed. How is this possible? How can we do that? How can we convey all that phonemic information that quickly, that efficiently? Two reasons. One, there's two sources of information, two sources of visual information happening at the same time. The hand information, those hand cues, and then the natural lip movements of speech, the natural mouth movements. So two sources of information, the mouth and the hand at the same time are integrated to convey phonemic information. So we have two sources of information coming together. That helps to make it efficient. One more reason why cued speech is efficient for conveying phonemic information is this ability to convey a whole syllable with one placement of a handshake, with one movement. So we know that we take a consonant handshape and put it in a vowel placement to convey a CV, a consonant vowel syllable. Let's think about, we're going to think about two examples, the word moo and the word Mississippi. But before I go into that, I want to just say that to me, this is one of the genius elements of cued speech, was this idea of how to convey all this visual information quickly and efficiently. And Dr. Cornett's concept of using two sources of information and then one movement to convey two bits of information simultaneously, that just leads to this concept of efficiency. So let's look at some examples of cueing and using visual phonics. So let's think about the word moo. So the cued speech cues, cue singular for moo, consonant hand shape. In the oo vowel placement, we have moo. Okay. And then we have the visual phonics cues for moo. And I have the pictures here, and I'll also demonstrate it. So the movement, the VPQ is the open hand moving, make like two ripples from the chin, and then the vowel oo is in VP, oo, oo. So the visual phonics cues for moo are so contrast cued speech cues, moo, and then visual phonics, moo. Just interesting contrast there. Oh, I should say, I am a certified instructor of cued speech. I've been cueing for many, many years. I am not a trained visual phonics user, but I have done a lot of looking at demonstrations of visual phonics, speaking with visual phonics users in professional settings. So my background in visual phonics, reading the literature about it, my background in visual phonics is different than my cued speech background, but I've tried to learn enough that I can demonstrate some of the differences. So we've talked about the differences in cueing moo and using the visual phonics cues for moo. Let's think about Mississippi. Mississippi is going to be 4 cue placements in cued speech. So 4 syllables showing all 8 phonemes. Mississippi. In visual phonics, there will be 8 separate cues to show those 8 phonemes. So difficult to put those together to show the word at speech speed. So efficiency in conveying phonemic information is one critical difference between cued speech and visual phonics. Then I'd like us to think about how well these two systems cue characteristics of speech. Now we have to remember that cued speech was not designed to do that. It was not designed to model or to convey how speech sounds are produced. Cued speech is used to specify which sounds are being said, but cued speech cues don't provide articulatory information. They're not designed to teach people or to show how speech is produced. Visual phonics cues are intended, as we said earlier, to mimic some features of speech, to provide some information about how the sound is produced. So this is another major way that these systems differ, how the cues are designed to do subtly different things. I have questions about how this works with visual phonics when we're thinking about representing articulation accurately. For example, thinking about allophones, all those different ways that we produce phonemes. Remember the tough phoneme that we were talking about a minute ago, and the visual phonics cue to represent the flicking of the tongue. Now, that's not always how that sound is produced. Sometimes the tongue goes up to the alveolar ridge and stops at the end of a word. Like if we were going to say pat, pat, I'm not releasing the T there. There's no flick of the tongue there. If we think about a word like mitten, mitten with that glottal stop in the middle, the tongue's not even producing that allophone of T. So there's some, I am not clear about how some of the visual phonics cues actually convey the speech information unless you know a lot already about how the sounds are produced. Let's go back to that phoneme. And remember, it was the sort of the ripple of the hand from the chin. What feature of the sound is that motion conveying? Is it the continuance of the phoneme? Maybe. Is it, but it doesn't get to the nasality of that phoneme. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about. What about that movement is representative of speech? I think it's an interesting question. So let's think about what is being conveyed by these cues. So VP cues are very effective for conveying sounds in isolation, single syllables like CV units, consonant vowel units, and simple words. So sounds in isolation like ba, ba, single syllables, bow, bow, or simple words, boat, boat. With VP, you can do that. You can do sounds in isolation, single syllables, simple words. Very useful. So what can we do with these things that we can do with VP? Speech and articulation development. Several studies have shown that this can be a good tool, a good system for developing speech skills, developing articulation skills. I think this is why a lot of SLPs have really glommed onto this, have really decided this is a great thing to do, because it's support for articulation. It is also very useful for basic phonemic awareness activities. You can look at rhyme. You can show beginning phonemes. You can count the phonemes in a word like boat using VP cues. It's very good for that. So for basic phonemic awareness activities, anecdotally, and some research suggests that basic phonemic awareness activities can be done very well with visual phonics. So from the See the Sound website, from the Visual Phonics See the Sound website, this states that visual phonics is not a communication method. And it typically is just one part of a comprehensive reading and language program. So typically people use visual phonics as a support for speech therapy, articulation therapy, and as a means of doing basic phonemic awareness, but using a larger curriculum for language and literacy development. So let's contrast that with thinking about the elements of language we can cue. So we know that we can cue single phonemes. We can cue phoneme sequences, putting phonemes together. We can cue whole words. We can cue connected language. And just because I like to show off, when I learned how to use Canva, a graphic design tool, I have a little chart that I did for a publication. So this is just a summary of what we've talked about so far. So thinking about the elements of language that we can represent with cued speech, we know that we can show phonemes. We can show whole syllables. We can show simple words. We can show complex words. And we can show conversation and connected language. Visual phonics, we can do the first three of these. We can do phonemes. We can do syllables. We can do simple words, longer words, connected language, conversation, much more difficult. So thinking about what we can use cued speech for, we've already said that we know that cued speech is efficient and effective for the reception of all critical elements of spoken language. So for phonology, or the sounds of our language, morphology, putting those sounds together in meaningful units. For semantics, conveying the vocabulary, conveying the meaning of our language. For conveying and for conveying pragmatics, meaning how we use language in real context, how we change register for different situations. We can do all of those things with cueing. So we know we can use cued speech for communication, for conveying all those elements of language, not just the simple consonant, vowel, consonant units. This provides us foundations for literacy, phonemic awareness, like we've talked about, for developing vocabulary, semantics, meaning, and acquiring those features of language like syntax, grammar, structure, how we put words together to make sentences and longer units. Discourse, how we put sentences together to put together coherent thought. And then pragmatics, how we use language in different situations. I wanted to make a little footnote here. I've said that cued speech is efficient and effective for the reception of the critical elements of spoken language, and that cueing was not designed for speech development, for articulation development. But what a lot of SLPs have noticed in practice is that cued speech cues can also be used for articulation development. They are helpful for that, even though they weren't designed to do that. They were more designed for the reception of spoken language. So then, just to summarize, visual phonics can aid phonemic awareness, but those visual phonics cues may be difficult to use for connected language. So I want to talk a little bit about misperceptions about cued speech and visual phonics. And these are things that I've heard at professional conferences and workshops by practitioners, by researchers, by people discussing the differences between the systems, and sometimes some incorrect statements have been put out that lead people to make unwarranted conclusions about cute speech. So one myth I have heard a number of times is that only visual phonics can convey individual phonemes. So the idea that because there's a separate movement for each phoneme in visual phonics, and we cue whole syllables with cute speech, that, oh, cute speech cannot convey individual phonemes. And that's simply a misunderstanding of how the system works. We can cue individual phonemes with cute speech and more. A second myth that I've heard often is that cued speech is not a language, so it can't be used for language acquisition. We know that cued speech can convey all the critical elements of language, phonology, morphology, the whole list. It can convey elements of language just like print conveys language. Speech conveys language. Signs convey language. Cues are simply another way to convey language. So yes, cues themselves are not a language. They convey a language. They are a mechanism for communicating a language. So you may have heard some of those misperceptions, some of those myths, and we can talk about more of those when we get to some Q&A. So let's think about the implications for language and literacy of these two systems. So we'll start with cute speech. Research indicates that cute speech provides accurate and efficient visual access to spoken language. We know that. Cute speech allows children to develop phonemic awareness, decoding skills, and language skills necessary for reading comprehension. Reading is more than decoding. Reading is more than sound symbol correspondence. To read fluently, you need to have language skills to understand what you read. So we know that visual phonics is a fine tool for basic phonemic awareness, but because it can't be used for communication, for that language acquisition process, it is not, I think, as robust a foundation for literacy as cute speech is. Almost all of the studies of visual phonics involve a larger curriculum using other literacy programs and curriculum to develop skills in children. And then visual phonics is simply one component of that program. I wanted to touch on some of the research base for these two systems. So we'll start with visual phonics and we'll go back to 2005. And we know that Bev Trzek and her colleagues have done a number of the studies for visual phonics. And if we look at their 2005 study, this was a group study of children using visual phonics as part of a larger curriculum for reading and decoding, which was delivered using VP. And they found positive support, positive effects for the use of VP as an instructional tool for phonemic awareness and phonics. And then Trzek and her colleagues in a later study in 2007 found that visual phonics was useful in speech language therapy, which we've alluded to earlier, and also had positive effects on phonemic awareness. And then in 2015, Tucci and Easterbrooks did a single subject design with 3 subjects, and they used a literacy curriculum delivered with VP. And they found that their subjects made gains in phonemic awareness and in letter sound identification. What's interesting in this study, 3 subjects, 2 of them had more residual hearing. They made greater gains. And I think this leads to questions about the utility of visual phonics for students who are relying totally on vision. So if students do better with visual phonics when they have greater sound awareness, that I think that leads to some questions. But interesting to note that no studies have demonstrated that visual phonics results in higher level language skills, language acquisition, and reading comprehension. what studies have demonstrated, very good for speech development, basic phonemic awareness. Then let's look at a few cued speech studies that relate to reading skills. So if we go back to 2010 and look at Kelly Crane and Carol Assasso's work, they showed that the overall performance of cued speech users was similar to that of hearing subjects on rhyme generation measures, which is a phonemic awareness skill, and that the reading comprehension of cued speech users was not correlated with hearing and not correlated with speech intelligibility. So how much residual hearing, how much auditory access you had, these subjects had, did not predict how well they would do with cued speech, which is just an interesting finding. A group of Belgian researchers in 2013 did a longitudinal study, and they looked at, with early cued speech users, kids who were Q2 very young, they outperformed the other groups of deaf participants on reading by the end of second grade. They had better performance than kids who were Q2 later and kids who had just started cueing. So kids who were Q2 early in life, by the time they hit second grade, were reading well. Here's the kicker. No significant differences for those early cued speech users compared to hearing control subjects. That's always an interesting finding when deaf readers are reading like hearing readers. That's what we're looking to see. And then Bev Trzek again in 2017 pulled a lot of these studies together, did a beautiful analysis of the research literature on the role that cued speech plays in developing reading abilities. So if you're interested in digging deeper into the research, I highly recommend you take a look at Bev's work. So then to sum this all up, we know that cued speech provides an efficient and effective means to convey spoken language as a foundation for the development of literacy. And so now I will open this up for discussion, questions, Q&A. So I'll stop sharing and you all can turn cameras on, unmute yourselves, put a question in the chat. Looking forward to discussion. Don't be shy.
Kathy, do you want me
Kathy?
to read the question?
Do you want me to read the
Yeah,
question?
go to chat.
Should I
Sure,
get in the chat?
Okay.
sure, that'd be great.
The question was,
The question was,
okay, from Shay,
from Sherry Bieber.
she says,
She says,
I mean, I didn't teacher of the deaf
I'm an itinerant teacher of the deaf.
can go expect integrating into my direct instruction soon as time.
Can cued speech be integrated into my direct instruction time?
Absolutely. Anytime you want to provide clear visual access to spoken language, cueing is a great way to do that. This makes your direct instruction time more efficient and effective.
We have another question
We have another question
from Rachel McAdam.
from Rachel McAnallen.
How good,
How young
can you go English
How young can you cue English
with deaf or hard of hearing individuals versus goes?
with deaf, hard of hearing individuals versus using VP cues?
That's a really interesting question. And you can, because you can cue anything you can say at natural speech speeds, it's easy to start with young children cueing everything you say about your daily routine, cueing your motherese, your parentese, you know how we talk to young children. sort of like some people talk to their dogs. So you can, because you can cue anything you can say, you can cue all of your language to young children. With VP, you can cue those basic elements. You can cue individual sounds. You can use VP for simple words. So you could cue single words. You could model single words. So you could do that with young children. You would just be more limited in how much you could convey, how you could use that, how fluently you can do that. Really good question. So could you use VP with young children? Yes, but you would be limited in what you could, how much of your language you could convey that way.
Next comment question was from
The next comment or question was from
Laura Pedashek.
Laura
I'm
Pelishek? I'm not sure how you say that. Sorry.
I'm a hard band
I'm a hard of hearing parent
who homeschools my deaf son.
who homeschools my deaf son,
Currently teaching him to read.
currently teaching him to read.
To learn correct speech alongside with the instruction.
Do we learn cued speech alongside reading instruction?
Or take
Or
time to learn correct speech first, then return to the instruction.
or take time to learn cued speech first and then return to reading instruction?
This is
Oh, and she
Also-
says also,
down the street from Nazareth in Pittsford.
I grew up down the street from Nazareth in Pittsford.
Oh, great, great. Neighbor. So you can do both of these together. So I would introduce some cued speech, and young children pick it up very quickly, and then start to incorporate it into your reading instruction. You can do these simultaneously. I would take some of your reading instructions, some of your reading lessons, maybe phonemic awareness lessons, and start to cue them as a way to have your child develop that receptive skill with cueing. So you can do both of these simultaneously, and you'll begin to see how the cueing can support your reading instruction. I'm seeing more.
The question more. Yes,
There's a question more, yes. We got more.
this one is from Jess. What is
Next one is from Jess.
absolutely sold on the good speech
I'm absolutely sold on the utility of cued speech
and introduced in the 0 to 3 period
when introduced in the 0 to 3 period
to build English language fluency.
to build English language fluency.
But one question I have still is whether good speech can be a functional useful intervention.
But one question I still have is whether cued speech can be a functional, useful intervention for
ASL dominant school age children
ASL dominant school age children
who don't have foundational fluency in English.
who don't have foundational fluency in
Who are
English,
tasked with learning English literature.
who are tasked with learning English literacy.
If good speech is useful for this purpose, what does
If cued speech is useful for this purpose,
the roadmap career intervention look like for them?
what does a roadmap of cueing intervention look like for them?
This is a great question, thinking about, can we use cueing with older kids in a bye-bye program who have ASL as a first language, perhaps? So absolutely, and there's some interesting schools for the deaf. There's some interesting programs that are doing that. So using ASL for instructional purposes in ordinary curriculum and content, but when the focus is on English, when the focus is on English language arts, using cueing as a vehicle for presenting that information. Sometimes it starts with the speech language pathologist using it in speech and language therapy when the focus is on spoken language, and then using it for phonemic awareness, using it for vocabulary building, using it for some of those splinter skills as a way to develop the ability to understand it and then use it for more language acquisition and for language learning. So building it in where it makes sense to focus on spoken language, I think is a wonderful route for having people realize this is simply it's a vehicle for access to language. So wonderful to have bye-bye programs that offer deaf children access to both ASL and to spoken language, but providing a vehicle to make that access to spoken language accurate and efficient. So often what happens, in my experience, what I've been told many times, SLPs who are used to using these cueing systems to provide access to spoken language, they start doing it in their sessions, when they're focusing on spoken language. And then deaf students realizing, oh, this is really a great way for me to access spoken language, and then expanding it to other uses. So one way to think about starting it is within that kind of context. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for that. I don't know if there's someone else among the participants who's doing that, who's been involved with that kind of context, who wants to jump in. Let's take advantage of our audience.
Yeah.
Or we can go on to the next question. Oh, here, I think Rachel's offering a suggestion. Oh, I see Marquesa is asking about getting the PowerPoint slides. I'm happy to share those, Esther. So if you and Scott can send them out to participants, would that be possible?
So what? I missed that.
Share what? I missed that.
Oh, share the PowerPoint, my slides. I'm happy to share those.
Okay.
So we can send those out. And then Rachel is suggesting putting Jess in touch with schools that have introduced cueing in an ASL dominant environment. Like Rachel may be thinking about the Illinois School for the Deaf, and that would the professionals there would be great to talk to, because they've had a very interesting road to introducing cute speech in that kind of environment. I was just visiting with Kitri Kylo recently and thinking about the Minnesota program that was using ASL and cute speech. And there's different ways to do that. Oh, and then Debbie Love is asking about the use of cute speech at the Illinois School for the Deaf. Has it improved the literacy rates of their students? I don't have the specific research results from the Illinois School for the Deaf. I don't think that those have been published recently, but in several presentations I've heard they did see really good results there. Yeah, Esther.
Well, question from Sharon.
I have another question from Sherry.
Send them in direct message.
She's been sending them in direct message.
If my students and parents
If my students had parents and parents, if my students and parents
do not know cueing speech,
do not know cute
it
speech,
is a good way to introduce cueing speech through video instruction.
what is a good way to introduce cute speech for reading instruction?
Specific thinking about my K1 students.
I'm specifically thinking about my K1 students.
I think there are lots of places where there are kids being cued to in schools who aren't getting it at home. And so I think it's another tool that a teacher can introduce as part of reading instruction. So when you're doing a phonics lesson, when you're doing phonemic awareness, you can use simple cues. You don't have to start out using the whole system, but you can do consonant vowel units. You can practice using those basic CVs that you're going to be talking about. You know, this letter says this. So using it in that context, an easy context like that. Kids view it often as a code. Is it something to figure out? And so typically when we work with kids, we don't teach them analytically. We don't teach them the way we teach adults, like this is the and we teach kids often by cueing to them. So with kids in kindergarten and first grade, I would cue elements of my lesson. Just cueing, we're talking about the difference between ba and pa. I would cue those and then cue syllables and move to words. So introducing it in a way that just is sort of natural alongside with saying the sounds, giving visual information to make them more clear. But when we work with young children at that stage, typically we don't teach them the way we teach adults. I think there's a lot of misconception about that. With older kids, older students, I used to work at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf and would sometimes teach college students, deaf college students, using cue speech. Them I would teach more analytically. But younger kids, we do it more receptively, cueing to them. Lots of comments here. So Rachel is suggesting some research findings. Or Esther, go ahead.
Because I had a question that's getting buried.
Yes, Polly has a question that's getting buried.
She wanted to ask,
She
why do
wanted
you
to
think
ask
studies on reading comprehension
why you think studies on reading comprehension
in children who are deaf
in children who are deaf
only include ASL and NSL users
only include ASL and LSL users
and fairly good exclusives.
and rarely acute speech users.
Researchers study what they know or what they have access to. So if researchers are connected with a school for the deaf, that's an ASL dominant school, ASL using school, that's what they have access to for subjects, that's what they do. It takes a lot of experience and knowledge, awareness.
It's got it frozen.
Is Kathy frozen?
Frozen for me.
There, okay, screen was frozen for just a second.
Got it. Go froze for about
Kathy
10 seconds.
froze for about 10 seconds.
That's it, froze again.
Oh, she froze again.
Uh-oh. Am I frozen? Oh no.
You're
You
good.
okay now?
You're okay now.
Okay, I just closed a window. Sorry. Technology is lovely, except when it's not. So I was just saying that why Polly asked, why aren't more cueing kids included in studies of reading comprehension in deaf children? And that's simply that researchers, they study what they know or what they're aware of. And we need more researchers out there who recognize the utility of cueing and start to include cueing kids in studies.
Did you get Cameron's question?
Kathy, did you get Cameron's question?
Well, I gotta figure it.
I can read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. This is from Cameron.
This is from Cameron,
If
CFSLP,
had students
working with DHH and hearing students
in mainstream
and mainstream
from the examinations
from the SLP lens.
to have a beginners on when good implement one strategy over the other.
Do you have opinions on when you would implement one strategy over another?
I have many good students that I go with,
I have many queuing students that I queue with,
but would be if added maybe would also be beneficial for all the coordination purposes.
but I'm wondering if adding VP would also be beneficial for articulation purposes.
This is a great question and one that I would really love to see studied. I'm going to go out on a limb here. My personal feeling with my years of experience with cueing and what I know about the design of visual phonics, I think the element of visual phonics that really contributes to articulation development is the focus on the mouth. I'm not so sure that it's the cues themselves that help to convey articulation information, speech information. My gut feeling, and I do not have a study to back this up, but 30 plus years of experience, you can do as well with cued speech cues for speech development as you can with visual phonics. My gut feeling would be if you're already using cued speech and your kids know it, keep doing that. I wouldn't add in the other system. Now, I am perfectly open to being disproved that maybe visual phonics cues are better for articulation than cued speech cues, but there is no evidence of that. I hope that's helpful, but that's more of a gut feeling than study.
I think we got all the question except for just last follow-up.
Let's see, I think we got all the questions except for Jess's last follow-up.
So she's wants to follow up. What do we how?
So she wants to follow up. I'm wondering how.
Is can be good for learning literature
Cued speech can be useful for learning literacy
when the students don't get no English,
when the students
don't get no English.
don't yet know English.
I often say good speech doubting as a character,
I often see cued speech
doubting
touted
as the character literacy intervention
as kind of a miracle literacy intervention
for this population,
for this population,
but they don't get no the vocabulary of English.
but they don't yet know the grammar and vocabulary of English.
So I'm skeptical how learning to sound out words
So I'm skeptical how learning how to sound out words,
because it goes will help them with the comprehension.
using cues to help sound out words will help them with reading comprehension.
It would seem to be that they would need to start with some kind of broad English.
It would seem that they would need to start with some kind of broad English,
That was acquisition focus.
language acquisition focus,
Again, to it is
akin to ELLS.
perhaps could explain and
Perhaps
introducing literacy later.
And increasing literacy later.
Introducing literacy.
Introducing literacy later.
Bingo, right on.
Be implementing at Mrs. Meg Ayester.
Jess, you're absolutely right. So some students need a language foundation before we get into reading comprehension and to sounding out words. So you're absolutely right. Using English as a second language, English language learning techniques, using Qt speech to make language accessible, to make it visually accessible is absolutely the way to go. It would be wonderful to talk to people at ISD about how they're doing that. I'm reminded of a very early study at Gallaudet that Dr. Cornett oversaw it when he was first introducing Qt speech, had developed it and was researching it. They used queuing with students who couldn't pass the reading comprehension test for placement into various curriculum, various courses at Gallaudet. And so he had a group of deaf college students that he used Qt speech with these English language learning techniques to develop their language skills, to work to then get into developing their reading skills. So there's early study of that, and I think more evidence through the years. So absolutely, for students who are old, for reading comprehension, starting with that ESL, that ELL approach is the way to go. So great thought. Good question.
It is after 9.
Well, it is after 9, so
Just get it off.
I guess we should get offline now.
Let's go, babes.
Any last comments, Kathy?
Just thinking there's so much interest in what Illinois School for the Deaf is doing. Maybe that's another topic for an NCSA webinar. And thank you all for your great questions. I enjoyed this tonight. I hope you did too.
There's a question about it. If depending in training in Google speech.
There's a question about if you're interested in training Qt speech.
Google speech.org.
Do email the info@qtspeech.org. Yes, you can email us.
We get you in touch when there's someone doing a course.
We'll get you in touch with someone doing a course.
And Q College also offers, which is an affiliate of the NCSA, also offers training.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Have a
Good
good night.